for the book launch event. Today we are very pleased and honored to invite Mr. Bob Zoellick to join us for the launch of his recent masterpiece, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, which was published in 2020, almost 5 years ago, and has been translated into Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and Georgian. Okay, so today is the launch event for the Chinese version of this book. The author, Mr. Bob Zoellick, actually doesn't require introduction, but as a matter of formality, I still want to introduce him. Mr. Zoellick holds a JD magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, and also a master's degree in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and a bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College. He was the president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012, U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005, and Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2006. From 1985 to 1993, Mr. Zoellick served as counselor to the Secretary of Treasury and Under Secretary of State, as well as White House Deputy Chief of Staff. As a successful public and international figure, he has won recognition both at home and abroad. He has received awards and medals from U.S. Department of State, Department of Treasury, and also Department of Defense. And the German government, Mexican government, Chile government, and the Colombia government all presented with him with honors in praise of his contribution to relations with these countries. Mr. Zoellick, in his public career, has also made great contribution to China-U.S. relations, either as the USTR in facilitating China's joining WTO, and also in launching the strategic dialogue with Mr. Dai Bingguo when he was the Deputy Secretary of State. Even though he has not received any official award from the Chinese government, he has earned friendship and respect from the Chinese people, including from Professor Wu Xinbo at Fudan University. Telling where and when we first met. You still remember that?
I did.
That was in the summer of 1999. We had a week-long seminar in Aspen, Colorado. And we attended the seminar, and also we climbed the mountain together, along with our common friend, Mr. Oxenberg, Professor Oxenberg from Stanford University. And Professor Mike Oxenberg, as some of you may know, played an important role in the negotiation of normalization between China and the United States during the Carter administration. And in 2013, we invited Mr. Zoellick to Fudan University to attend the Shanghai Forum. And in this room, actually in this place, we had a wonderful dialogue about China-U.S. relations. So that was already 12 years ago. And we have stayed in close contact over the years, meeting in New York, Washington, and other places. I always enjoyed his wisdom and reading his comments about China-U.S. relations. So today, I'm very glad that he's able to come to Shanghai and back to the Center for American Studies at Fudan University for the book event. Now, please join me in warmly welcoming Mr. Zolik.
Well, thank you. It's both an honor and a pleasure to be here at Fudan. As you could see, I actually met Professor Wu long before he was famous. He was already famous. In the years since, I've now been meeting some of his students. So I always look at Professor Wu as a young man in that picture, but I guess he's gotten a little older, as we all have over time. But he's always had wonderful insights about China, the US, the world. So it's a real fortunate for Fudan University and for all of you to be able to study with him. And so I'm very pleased that he was able to host this event. Let me begin by explaining why I wrote this book. When I was in government, I often drew upon history as I thought about working on problems, whether German unification or trade or climate or other issues. And so I thought I wanted to suggest to younger generations how they might also think about history as they focus on foreign policy. Now, many of you will have studied international relations or foreign policy, and you know that many courses in foreign policy now rely on international relations theory. Maybe even Professor Wu has taught international relations theory. And my observation was that while the theories of international relations are intellectually interesting and often fun to debate, they weren't of much practical use when it came time to diplomacy. But instead, I often found that drawing examples from history would not necessarily offer analogies, but they would give you insights. They would prod questions for you to think about. And so, as many of you know, the late Dr. Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy in the 1990s. And he used history to talk about foreign policy. But given his origins, you'll see that the book relies heavily on the European experience. So my idea with this book was to try to draw more on the American experience and ideas. You'll see that the book is built around stories. In some ways, it's a multiple biography because each chapter is about a person and a problem. So it doesn't try to cover 200 years of history, but it tries to look at individual episodes to think about foreign policy. And a little different from some books on foreign policy, perhaps reflecting my background, in addition to the security issues, you'll see chapters on finance and trade and technology or transnational relations. But I also think for whatever country you're from, what you'll see with the book is I'm trying to give you some experience about the art of diplomacy. It might be mediation. It might be negotiation. It might be trying to frame policies with a set of ideas and advocacy. So in a way, what I'm trying to do with the book is share the experience of the practice of diplomacy, not the theory of diplomacy. Now, in the case of U.S. and China relations, there are 3 chapters that focus particularly on the U.S.-China history, but there are some other chapters that where the theme runs throughout. So one is at the end of the Qing dynasty, and what is known, at least in the Western world, as the Boxer Uprising in sort of 1899, 1900. The second is 1921, 1922, the Washington Naval Conference, which some of you may not even know about, but I'll explain how it has a connection with China. And the third is Nixon and Kissinger in the opening with China. But there are other aspects of the book that deal with other aspects. But just again to give you a little sense about the book, you'll see the introduction opens with the story of Ben Franklin during our revolution in Paris. So this is over 200 years ago. And that might seem like a very distant time. You might ask about the relevance. But if you read those pages, and they're not long, what you'll discover are the following. One, it's a story of moving from war to peace. Well, that's certainly relevant today. Second, it's a story of diplomacy with Franklin playing a very weak hand. The United States is weak. It's not even recognized by France at the time. Next, Franklin has to negotiate with his own delegation. Frankly, if you talk to most diplomats, not everybody agrees even on your own side. So you often have to negotiate with your own people. It's a negotiation with multiple parties. He's dealing with his ally, France. He's dealing with Britain. They've got Spain as part of the process. In our case, he also has to deal with the Congress. Congress is constantly tying his hands as he's trying to do the negotiations. Franklin is particularly interesting because in some ways, he's the person that invents public diplomacy. So if you look at Franklin when he was in Britain before the revolution, his portraitures of him as a scientist and as an educated man. But when he's in France, he dresses in sort of old brown clothes. He doesn't wear a wig. He's representing the image of a revolutionary America on the frontier. And you can see how he stylistically tries to represent this new nation in France. And all of you know France loves style. So this is a new style that he's sort of presenting. He has to deal with espionage. He has the question of timing. So at one point, one of his colleagues, at a time, a very dark day for the young United States, his colleague says to him, look, we should demand that the French give us recognition. Well, Franklin thinks better of it because the situation is pretty bleak. He waits for an American military victory at Saratoga and then approaches the French. So a lot of diplomacy is not just having the right ideas, it's being able to do it at the right time. The part that I find most striking about Franklin, and this is really an important lesson for diplomacy, is keeping your eye on the primary objective. What do you really want to accomplish? Because it's very easy in diplomacy to be distracted. You don't like the argument. Somebody is being nasty to you. You sort of becomes an internal debate. But it's always really important to keep an eye on is what do you want to accomplish to get done? And Franklin has this other comment that I found in my life, which he said, even small gestures can influence great people in big events. Friendships and partnerships and trust can't dictate the course of history, but sometimes they can facilitate it. And how you treat people and the relationships that you build is often an important part of diplomacy. And there's a wonderful line at the end, which is when the United States is able to negotiate its independence from Britain, one of Franklin's colleagues says, oh, the American people will owe you a great debt of gratitude. And Franklin says, I've never seen a peace settlement where someone isn't unhappy. And there's a phrase in the Bible about blessed are the peacemakers. And Franklin says, that may be true in the next life. It's not true in this one. Someone's always complaining about the result. I just give you this example because if you think about any of these incidents that I'm discussing, you can start to see some parallels with things that are going on today. Now, in the case of the U.S. and China, as I reflected on the book, there are three themes that I draw from the U.S. relationship with China over time. One is the dream of a great commercial opportunity, which always falls a little bit short. The second is China as a potential power. And the third is the U.S. missionary impulse towards China. So let me explain each of these. So in 1784, so this is after our revolution, but before we've actually created the Constitution for the United States, a ship called the Empress of China sails to, at that time, Canton, Guangzhou, and with 40 tons of ginseng from Appalachia. and the profit is 400%. And this is, in some ways, the first example of the idea of the great China market, always shining, but maybe a little bit over the horizon. And within 6 years, you've got 30 ships going to Canton. So it's a great market. But what you also see is whether it's at this point or later, for example, in 1900, I'll talk about, which is the open door policy, which is, again, the idea of China as a potential market. I have a book downstairs in my library that is titled 400 Million Customers. And it was written in 1937 by somebody that said, wow, 400 million customers in China. This is a great opportunity. Of course, it's right before World War II devastates everything. And if you go back to Deng Xiaoping's opening, reform and opening, or China coming into the WTO, there's again this sense of great economic opportunity. But the part of this story is it's always a dream a little bit over the horizon, and sometimes there's frustrations, and I'll come back to that point. The second theme is China as a potential power. And this is a very interesting one. In some ways, I'm not sure why this developed the way it did. Maybe in a way, the United States, having overthrown its own colonial rulers, had an empathy for China. But in 1900, so at the very end of the Qing dynasty, you had a period where the European powers, Britain, France, also Japan, also Russia, were carving up China, making it into either various colonial areas or sort of mandates. And again, to give you a reference point, that might seem a very distant part of history, although Chinese remember it. But about the same time, they had just carved up Africa. They'd carved up Africa into a whole series of colonies. And interestingly enough, Elihu Root, who's one of the men I talk about in here, is Secretary of War, later Secretary of State. He writes his wife, and he says, dividing up China would be a tragedy that only could match by the breakup of the Roman Empire. So it's an interesting idea. The idea that Chinese sovereignty is very important. And of course, this is one of the principles when John Hay, who's the Secretary of State I write about, talks about the open door. It's not only economic, but it's trying to stress the territorial integrity of China. A little bit later, and most people are unaware of this, but after World War I, and you have the Versailles Peace Treaty, one of the aspects of the treaty that the U.S. Senate and the American public really don't like is that Shandong, which had been a German concession, is given to Japan. And so there's, again, this idea of respecting the notion of the potential of China in the world. In this conference I mentioned, 21-22, this is a question about naval arms control with the United States, Japan, and Britain. But there's a theme here about where the United States is trying to help nationalist China get control over its customs, its railways, its radio. And again, this is when Shandong Peninsula actually is returned to control of China. You, of course, will have known the Shandong story through the May 4th movement. This is the big event that sort of creates the stimulus for the students in May 4th. In World War II, Franklin Roosevelt looks upon China as one of the major allies and is expecting after the war that there will be 4 policemen in the world: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China. Obviously, the victory of the Communist Party in 1949 disrupts this. You then have the Korean War of 1950 to 53. But then Nixon and Kissinger is again recognizing the role of China. And in a small way, the work that I was talking about with China as a responsible stakeholder in 2005 is again this notion of China as a power or potential power. And today we've got the fear of China's power. The third one is probably forgotten in most of diplomatic history because religion has played less of a role in recent years. But I think it's quite important in the case of China, and that's the missionary impulse. So the Christian missionaries to China in the 19th century are very important in shaping American public attitudes towards China. they're not only bringing religion, they're trying to bring modernization as they see it. So they brought schools, universities, hospitals, medical. It's a view of trying to engage China of a modernization model. And of course, this is what also brings the first generation of Chinese students to the West. So one example of this, I know it's not Fudan, but as you may know, Tsinghua University was founded because after the Boxer Uprising, there was an indemnity given to the Western powers. The U.S., this is very typically American. The U.S. says, no, we don't want the indemnity, but when others take it, then we say, okay, well, we'll take some money. But they put it to help found Tsinghua University. So Tsinghua University was founded with the Boxer indemnity, and it started a fellowship program in 1908 that sent over 30,000 students. And it was actually also the origin of the Fulbright program, which was to educate foreign students. Now, what's important also about these missionaries is that they become the interpreters of China to the United States, because most Americans are not speaking Chinese. So the people who know China are often the children of the missionaries. So if you go back and you look at many of the American ambassadors to China, they were often children of the missionaries. If you look at Time magazine, Henry Luce, big influential American public opinion in the 20th century, he was a child of missionaries. If you think about many of the universities, some of you may know there's a Yale in China program. Yale is considered to be the Fudan of America. Not quite. Where does that come from? It's from training the missionaries. Oberlin College, if you go visit Oberlin College in Ohio, they have this big sort of monument to the missionaries. Because this is, in a way, they were trying to teach people to become missionaries, and they formed this connection. And Pearl Buck, who was an author who, I think she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. She won the Pulitzer Prize. She wrote a book titled The Good Earth. And The Good Earth was made into a movie that was seen by millions and millions of Americans. So now we're not talking about the educated elite. We're talking about the average American trying to understand this. Now, here's the complex part. In a way, the missionaries are trying to convert China to Christianity, to capitalism, to what I'll call a small r notion of a republic. And here's the problem. When China decided that it didn't want to be converted and wanted to choose its own path, then all of a sudden, as you can imagine, the reaction swings like a pendulum, because in some ways, if you think you're being generous and offering and something is rejected, it's even harder than if somebody is just hostile to you. So if you look at these three ideas, commercial opportunity, but never quite the ideal being reached, the notion of Chinese power, either positive or negative, and the notion of the missionaries, you can see that the relationships of the U.S. and China are, in a way, highly personalized. It's not, we obviously have relations with Britain and Germany and others, but with China, it's a unique combination from these aspects. So, and if you think again, whether it's 1900, whether it's 1949, whether it's 1989 or the past decade, you can see examples of this relationship sort of going backwards and forwards. So what I want to try to do today was just to give you a flavor, and that a book about history, in my mind, is not a book that's trying to tell you just right or wrong. The theme that I try to emphasize is the pragmatism of trying to solve problems. But there's another idea here, which is that history is a wonderful way of trying to better understand yourself and others. And so again, from my perspective, as I've worked with diplomacy over time, I've tried to learn the history of other countries to gain their perspective. Now, I'm an American. There's always limits. My language skills are not what yours already are. But I think if you want to engage in foreign policy and diplomacy, you don't have to agree with the other person, but you need to have some sense of where they're coming from. And obviously, you see this in the discussion now in China of the century of humiliation and trying to overcome that and that understanding of history. My own view is the Chinese history of that period is more complex, but that's something we can discuss. So why don't I stop there?
Okay.
I can leave it up. Okay.
Bob Zolik has just, shared with some of his thoughts on U.S. diplomacy and particularly the central themes in U.S. relation with China, commercial power and religious impulse. We can get back to this question, to these issues. Let me start by asking him the first question. In this book, he mentioned at the very beginning that actually he was inspired by Henry Kissinger's masterpiece Diplomacy, and then he decided to write another book similar to Diplomacy. How long did this take for you to finish this book, by the way?
Well, Shinbo,
I keep hearing you telling me you are writing this book, right? 10 years.
Well, I started thinking about the book about the time that I met you. I don't know if that's coincidence in the late 90s. But maybe you inspired me as a scholar. But then
thank you.
Then I went into government. So I was at U.S. Trade Representative, State Department, World Bank. So I had other things to do for a while.
Okay.
But then I really started to refocus on it around 2016. And I live multiple lives now, so I'm not just a scholar as you are. But and so it took me about 2 or 3 years to really. But the ideas had been germinating for a while. I mean, as you can tell, the way I tried to think about history when I was doing policy. But frankly, part of the thought was that I wanted to leave for younger generations and for people who like historical stories a different perspective on foreign policy. So it's not a memoir, although there's a chapter that draws on some of my experience about in 89, 90 when I'm talking about Bush 41 and Baker. But there are, as you know, there are insights about the nature of diplomacy that I try to weave through.
Now, since you were inspired by Henry Kissinger's Diplomacy, and then you had the book America in the World. In your opinion, what are the major differences between these two masterpieces, and which one is better in your opinion?
Well, I would never presume to compete with the late Henry Kissinger. He was one of a kind. But as I mentioned, as I was thinking about the book and thinking about Kissinger's diplomacy, I was trying to recognize the different perspective he had from his European experience than I might from the U.S. experience. So let me give you a couple examples. Kissinger, who was a master of one line, said in the 19th century, he said the U.S. didn't have a foreign policy. Okay. Well, if you're looking at the world from the perspective of European security, the U.S. wasn't very engaged. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of the U.S., your main objective is how do you deal with the settlement and territory of a continent while creating a union? And so you're having to deal with the British, the French, the Spanish, the Russians, the Mexicans. Part of it is that we buy the territory, and part of it is that we take the territory, which leads long time questions about set of relations. There's a chapter I have about Lincoln and Seward in our Civil War, and the key line that Lincoln emphasizes is one war at a time. And the point here was, how do you avoid French and British intervention on the side of the Confederacy, which probably would have changed the course of the war. And in summary, what they're doing is it's a combination of threat and restraint. They're signaling to the British and French, if you do this, you're going to pay a price, but they're trying to avoid going over the line because they don't want to have two wars at a time. So that's one perspective. A second would be, as we've discussed, given Kissinger's background, he focuses really on security issues. I'm bringing in trade. I have Alexander Hamilton in finance. I have a chapter on a man named Vannevar Bush on science and technology. And one reason I did that was based on my experience with climate change negotiations. I figured the challenge of combining diplomacy and science, whether it's biological security and pandemics, whether it's oceans, whether it's climate, is a special challenge about how you sort of draw these together. And then I suppose the other part, as you know, Henry Kissinger was the classic theme of realism in foreign policy. And I have chapters, I'm sympathetic to that view, and I have chapters that deal with balance of power, mediation, alliances, arms control and regional security and others. But I also have some other themes. So I have the theme of international law, which I don't think you'd find as much in Henry's books. I have trade. I have the transnational. So I guess talk to you about missionaries. You won't find transnational relations in Henry's work because that's not the way he looks at the world. Okay? But I think that missionary relationship with China is quite important in terms of understanding some of the context. And also someone like Ronald Reagan, who saw the Cold War ultimately as a battle of ideas, but also was willing to engage in negotiation. So I would see my book as a complement or supplement.
Okay. Very good. Your last time to Fudan was in May 2013, as I just mentioned. Actually, 4 months after that, Henry Kissinger was here, sitting in this seat and talking to our students and faculty.
Did you ask him about my book? No.
I was not aware of that. Okay.
Yeah, good line.
But what's interesting was that, in the conversation, in addition to, talking about his usual favorite topics like war and peace, he began to talk about how technology like cyber may affect international relations, including changing the way people work and study. So I guess at that time, maybe he began to think about AI. So
and his last book was on AI.
That's true. That's true. So that shows he also, keeps learning in his.
I persuaded him.
Okay, great. Now, my second question is, in this book, I can tell, you value the spirit of pragmatism. And you talk about pragmatism as a philosophy in the United States, and also as a major value for U.S. diplomacy over the years. Now, taking U.S. diplomacy towards China as one example, you just mentioned, the rise of China led to this kind of fear in the U.S. today. So how would you comment on the last 3 administrations' approach to China? Let's say starting from Trump's first term, Biden, and now his second term, their approach to China, when it comes to pragmatism in U.S. Foreign policy.
So let me start by emphasizing the idea of pragmatism is not that it's a solution to all problems. It's a way of thinking. It's trying to move beyond intellectual conventions or dogmas that restrain you. And instead, it's trying to base on experience, trying to understand the facts on the ground, the people, the institutions, the power relationships, with the idea that you're trying to achieve results. And again, from my experience, if you can achieve imperfect results in a far from perfect world, that's still good progress. Okay, everything's not going to be changed overnight. But part of this in the story in the book is that people have varying degrees of success in this. So I have stories of failure. I have a chapter on Lyndon Johnson and where he decides to put ground troops into Vietnam in 64, 65. And this is a failure of pragmatism. In some ways, I'm critical of Woodrow Wilson and some of his approaches. So I don't mean pragmatism is to say this always works. It's trying to understand how it might work is more the question. So if I bring this to the Trump and Biden administrations, I think, and again, I'm trying to share with you how people perceived China at the time. I'm not saying this is always how I agree, but so I think the problem that they were trying to deal with, that Trump was trying to deal with, was twofold. One, with the rise of Chinese power, they were worried about a threat. And second, they were worried about unfair economic relations. The idea that when China came into the WTO, it took advantage of the system. Now, President Trump defined this primarily through the bilateral trade deficit. An economist would not use that measure, okay? But if you want to understand how he saw the problem. And even, if you go back and you see that while I had talked about the idea of a responsible stakeholder, so he's sort of moving to the great power sort of logic. Now, what was their solution? Their solution was a purchasing contract, which again, I'm a believer in open markets. This is not how I would have approached things, but I'm trying to give you a sense of the way they tried to solve the problem. They also started the idea of export controls. This is in Trump. And then I think if you go back and you look at it year by year, when COVID occurred, this created even more anxiety about what was the cause of this? Was there some conspiracy? Had this been created in a lab or so on and so forth? And some of the people in the Trump administration then also made the politics more ideological. I don't think Trump was ideological, but some of the people in the administration made it more ideological. You then get to the Biden administration, and then this is where domestic politics is important. I think President Biden didn't want to look weak. So in some ways, he continues some of these policies towards China. In part, he then focuses on trying to repair some of the alliance relationships that Trump had disturbed in the region. He keeps trade protectionism. And by the way, I argued against this because I felt the idea that Biden was ever going to compete with Trump on protectionism was not very likely, because Trump could always appeal to those who were frustrated, but nevertheless, that's what he chose. And then I think in a problem-solving way, I think both presidents realized that the relationship was spiraling downhill quite quickly. So they tried to create a floor. You then had the balloon incident and how that was handled. So that was a setback. So, and then did you want to know about Trump now? Or should I still have? Okay, well, this is coming so fast, I think everybody. So if you're confused, don't feel bad. Everybody's confused, whether in the US or Europe. My guess is it does represent some fundamental shifts. The question is how long and with what effects. And one way to look at this is, as you know, the book talks about 5 traditions of U.S. foreign policy. Well, again, what I'm trying to do with those traditions is to say these are important pillars. Well, look at what they tell you. One is North America, right? So in most foreign policy in the U.S., you never discuss North America. You discuss Europe and Asia or Latin America, but never North America. Well, Trump certainly has rediscovered North America. But he's doing it in a way very different than the way I would have done it or Ronald Reagan did. Okay, so instead, he's focused on illegal immigration. He's focused on fentanyl, and he's trying to bludgeon Canada and Mexico into submission on the issue. Now, again, just to give you a little historical reference, China or Mexico and the United States fought a war in 1846, 1847. And the United States took about a third or half of Mexico's territory. That left a very bad residue of relations for about 100 years. So when you look at the history of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which I was involved with, or other things, from my point of view, that was much more than a trade agreement. It was trying to create a reconciliation based on economic ties. Okay, so Trump obviously has a very different point of view. Second tradition is trade, transnationalism, and technology. Well, that's certainly a priority for Trump, but in a more protectionist form than I would. And in terms of technology, we'll see what develops out of the whole series of AI and other relationships. The third one is alliances. And the story that I tell is, as you know, for the first 150 years, the United States doesn't like alliances because they associate alliances with the European powers. And so George Washington says no permanent alliances, and Thomas Jefferson says no entangling alliances. The United States doesn't really pursue an alliance policy until 1945, and then it exists for 70 or 80 years. I was part of the group of people that tried to help at the end of the Cold War and then transform it. Trump looks at the world very differently. He looks at the world transactionally. Now, we'll have to see what happens. Maybe it will prod the Europeans to spend more on their own defense and it'll create a greater basis going forward. Or maybe it will disrupt those relations. These are hard questions to tell. The fourth one is public support. Here, it's too early to tell. The administration has just begun. Many Americans are not so sure where he's going with Putin, and they're not sure about this policy for Ukraine. On the other hand, he is addressing some of the issues such as illegal immigration that people wanted fixed. And so we'll see how that works out. And I think the most fundamental difference is I talk about the American purpose in the world. It's kind of a theme that's hard to get your hands on, but my point is it changes over time. So for the young United States, it's simply to survive as a republic in a world of empires. Then in our Civil War, it's to preserve the Union. Then by the early 20th century with Teddy Roosevelt and John Hay, it's more balance of power politics, which is part of what the open door is about. And then in World War II, it's the four freedoms, and then it's the leader of the free world or the indispensable power. President Trump has a very different view on this. His view is that the world has taken advantage of the United States. And so his view, the way I would describe it, but I've got my own bias, is it's a more narrow nationalistic self-interest view as opposed to a systemic view. I spent my career on systems, economics, security, and others. That's not the way he looks at the world. And then, I think the best clue I can give you is that he looks at life as a deal maker. It's transactional, okay? And personal relations are very important. But I'll close with one other point. But again, this is from my perhaps dated perspective. I think, Shinbo, we're at a time of some very fundamental changes here. And I can't predict where they'll turn out. But let me just give you three that I have some concern about. One, from the post-World War II period on, there was a international reaction against seizing territory with aggression. If you think about what's happened now with Russia and Ukraine, depending on how that's settled, that's really breaking a very important norm. And as you know, China traditionally has resisted the notion of changing territorial borders and sovereignty. But it's not only there, it's in the Middle East. You can see this with the idea, are we going to remake the states of the Middle East? You can see it in parts of Africa with the DRC and with Rwanda and with Libya and with Sudan. If this continues,
And Trump is going to take over.
and Trump wants Greenland, right? Exactly. And so, if that becomes the norm, that's a very different world. And so, it's a little scary to me, to be honest. But I'm just trying to help you as analysts to understand. The second and related point is we talked a little bit about this with alliances, but as you know, if you look at the history of analysis of nuclear proliferation. In the 1960s, most scholars believed there would be many more nuclear states today. One of the things that prevented that was the United States had a security umbrella. If, for example, this is an interesting conversation that I remember discussing with Dai Bing Guo 15 years ago, 20 years ago, was that if the United States ended its alliance relationship with South Korea. What do you think would happen in terms of South Korean nuclear policy? 70% of the Korean people want to have a nuclear weapon. If the United States is not the guarantor, what will they do? I don't know for sure. It's not an easy step, but think about it. If South Korea, North Korea, Russia, China all have nuclear weapons, what do you think people will think in Tokyo if the U.S. alliance isn't there? So I'm not predicting these. I'm trying to suggest to you that we've had certain assumptions about the international system. If that system radically changes, be careful what comes out of it. And then the last one, which we've talked about, is it's becoming more of a great power world. So one of my differences with some of the people and others in the United States is many people use a Cold War analogy. I don't think the Cold War is the right analogy. I think it's more the world of 1900, the world of big powers. But now the powers will be different. It'll be the U.S., it'll be China, it'll be India, Russia militarily, although I think Russia's got big economic problems. And will Europe come together in a more effective way? What happens to Japan? And from my perspective, one of the concerns I have about this is that, I spent a lot of time working with developing countries. Where do they fit into the system? Now, some of them will be shrewd. Some of them will maneuver. They'll have agency among the other countries. But I particularly worry about sub-Saharan Africa being left out of this. And then the last thought I'll share with you is, I'm often asked, is globalization in reverse? And from my point of view, if I look at the international economy, if I look at climate, if I look at pandemics and biological security, if I look at ocean policy, globalization, the phenomenon of globalization remained pretty strong to me. What's happened is the governance of globalization, the way you manage it, that is what's fragmented. Okay? And again, not to say that history repeats itself, but as Mark Twain said, sometimes it rhymes. And so this looks to me a little bit more like the early 20th century, and I don't like the way that song ended up. So these are the types of things that, frankly, you have to teach your students because they're going to have to solve these problems in the future.
So I think it's time for us to stop here. And once again, it has been a very good opportunity to have Ms. Zolik back to Fudan and to interact with our faculty and our students.
Can I make one more point?
Sure, yes.
Okay, so I thanks to all of you for your patience. And one other point here is that, look, I haven't been to China for a few years. One reason I wanted to come was to continue to hear what people in China are thinking, but also to encourage all of you, okay? Fudan is one of the world's great universities, okay? You are all extremely fortunate, the students that are here, okay? You obviously did very well on exams. You performed very well. You've got great faculty. You're in and you probably have other students from around the world that come here. But take with it, there's also some sense of responsibility. Okay? The things we've talked about at the end of the day are not going to be solved by me or even Wu Xunbo. It's going to be your generation that decides these things. And so we talked about the different twists and turns that things may take, whether it's the Middle East or economics or Russia, Ukraine, and others. We can't predict those. All we can try to do is share the experience. But what I'm trying to urge you, and the reason I talk to students in the US as well as in China and Europe and others, is you are the future. Okay, I'll just be a pensioner, and I don't want you to take away my pension. But otherwise, so please recognize you have been given a great opportunity, so use it wisely.
Well, that's a very good end note to this discussion. And just like we discussed the U.S. diplomacy as you presented in this book, and I think today people focus heavily on the Trump administration, and I believe that Trump doesn't necessarily represent the future of the U.S. and its politics and diplomacy. So with that, please join me in thanking Mr. Zolik again. for the book launch event. Today we are very pleased and honored to invite Mr. Bob Zoellick to join us for the launch of his recent masterpiece, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, which was published in 2020, almost 5 years ago, and has been translated into Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and Georgian. Okay, so today is the launch event for the Chinese version of this book. The author, Mr. Bob